My name is Tanishq, and I'm a placement student currently completing my Master of Social Work Placement at the Mental Health Foundation Australia, and I'm honored to be your host for today's webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work. I pay my deepest respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples joining us today. On behalf of the Mental Health Foundation Australia, I warmly welcome you and thank you for joining us today for this session, which is Rethinking Women's Distress, Context, Power, and Survival. Today's presentation invites us to consider a powerful question, which is what if the ways women are described as not coping are in fact evidence of what they have had to suffer? And talking about that, women are required to navigate legal, economic, and social systems that were not designed with their safety or equality in mind. From gendered violence to housing and financial insecurity, many face conditions that constrain, silence, or re traumatize. In response, women adapt. They minimize, endure, disengage, or choose not to seek help. These are not signs of dysfunction. These are strategies for managing environments that can feel unsafe, inaccessible, or unresponsive. And this presentation examines how these conditions shape women's lives and experiences of distress, and what is overlooked when mental health is understood without context. Drawing on these themes from her forthcoming book, Janine Hendry explores how power, inequality, and silence influences the ways women respond to harm. Too often, these responses are interpreted as individual deficits. This work asks what becomes possible when we instead recognize them as adaptations to systems that were never designed for women in the first place. So let's get started. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Janine Hendry. Janine Hendry is a writer, speaker, and advocate whose work focuses on gender, power, and women's life. She is the founder of the largest women's march in Australian history. With a background in academia and a career spanning design, strategy, and social impact, her work examines how structural inequality, violence, and silence shape women's experiences. She brings a system-informed lens that connects individual distress to broader social and institutional conditions. I'm sorry. Janine is the author of an upcoming book on power, inequality, and women's lives. Her work challenges the tendency to individualize women's distress and instead situates it within the system that produces it. So please join me in welcoming Janine Hendry.
Thank you, Tanish, and good afternoon, everyone. I feel very flattered to be here talking about women's lives, and it's really interesting when I hear people introduce me because it always makes me feel quite serious when we list all of the serious things that I actually do. And when I listen to these, I undoubtedly sit there and I nod politely. But inside my head, I'm thinking, if only all of you really knew the truth about me, only you knew that as a grown woman, I still have trouble telling my left from my rights. Not consistently, not reliably, but all the time. I am the grown woman who sits there driving a car, holding my fingers up to determine which way is left and which way is right. And you might say, Janine, we've got something called sat navs. What does it really, really matter? And I think it becomes so much more problematic when my sat nav says to me, just head north-northwest and change the slide. And you know what? If I knew where north-northwest was, I probably wouldn't need the sat nav to begin with. And I think somehow that's a fairly good metaphor for how women's lives actually are. Because despite all of the public facing things that I do, that we all do, we're still expected to hold so much, and that women are both highly competent. Next slide. But we're also really, really deeply unaware of what our skill sets are. And we assume that confidence arrives with visibility. It doesn't. It doesn't. What arrives instead is a hypervigilance to the environment that we work in, a self-monitoring, and an exhaustion of how we are all perceived over time. Next slide. And I can't tell you how many women I know spend entire meetings, and you must have experienced this. We spend entire meetings monitoring the emotional temperature in the room. Are we being too emotional? Are we being too aggressive, too ambitious, too difficult, too much? Women apologise before asking a perfectly reasonable question. Women, how many of you are guilty of this? Soften your soften your emails with emojis so that you don't seem too harsh, or you smile because you don't want others to feel uncomfortable. Some of you may remember Grace Tame's now infamous meeting with our previous Prime Minister at the handover of the Australian of the Year Awards, where she refused to smile in front of the Prime Minister. Can you remember the backlash that she received for that? Because she refused to make this man feel comfortable in the environment that we are in. And what we find, just moving on from that, is that women are constantly trained to calculate safety. We hold our keys in our hands when we walk to our cars at night. As I said, we manage everyone else's comfort. When I founded the March for Justice, and I think back to that time, for those of you that don't know much about the March for Justice, it was something that we put together in a period of 2 weeks. We decided that we'd had enough. And over a 2-week period, I put together a team of thousands of volunteers and managed what became the largest women's march in Australian history. And we organised 52 marches to happen simultaneously across Australia on the 15th of March 2021. And I was called brave for doing that. And that was kind of hard to cope with, because underneath I was emotionally very aware of what I was doing. But in my head, a narrative was running. Janine, maybe you push this too far. Maybe you need to sit down, make yourself smaller, be quieter, be nicer. And I recall being asked at the time if I would meet the Prime Minister, then Scott Morrison, in a face-to-face meeting. I was told this would be good for the women of Australia. But there was something about this meeting, this face-to-face meeting, that felt very uncomfortable to me. And I realised in the end that I couldn't meet the Prime Minister face-to-face because I was one voice and carrying the voice of all the women in Australia, and I wasn't prepared to meet with him behind closed doors in the very same spaces in which violence against women happens. But in my head, I realised that a narrative was running, as it does for so many women, which was, we're trained to be quiet. We're trained from childhood to be quiet, to not upset people, to not take up too much space physically, emotionally, socially, not to embarrass anyone. Don't make men feel uncomfortable. Definitely can't do that. Don't sound angry. And yet at the same time, next slide, women are expected to carry extraordinary emotional loads, to become the emotional infrastructure of society, to soothe, to organise, to anticipate, and to absorb the emotions of everyone around us. And it's this invisible system, this invisible emotional infrastructure that's holding society together and load bearing. And next slide, that doesn't become visible until the point of collapse. And we can look at this in the workplace. We can look at it in our domestic environments where women are carrying the load of managing children and households. We can see it in our educational systems, across society. And the important thing, as I said, is that emotional infrastructure only becomes visible at the point of collapse. And it's at that point where women say, can't do this anymore. And you know what happens? Everyone's shocked. Everybody is shocked because often the woman herself has been drowning for years. But because so many women have become highly adapted to carrying the emotional weight, the woman herself and society thinks it is normal. And it's not. After I did the March for Justice, in the immediate aftermath, in the hours after I'd stood down from the podium of organising the largest women's march in Australian history, the onslaught started, and I started receiving death threats on an hourly basis. I'd receive messages telling me, well, I was just lucky I didn't get raped because I was too ugly for anyone to want to rape me. And these messages explaining in great detail how people wanted to see me unalive in graphic detail. And they arrived so consistently. It was like the emotion and the fear stopped feeling so personal. It's as if it became the very environment that I was living in. At one point, I had to hire security just to get my child safely to and from school each day. But what I realised is that so many women would quietly come up to me and say, oh, I know how you must be feeling. Not because I'd organised emotional national protests, but because they knew quietly what that feeling was. They knew what the backlash would be. They knew how we understand the calculation of our safety risks, how loud we can actually be, how angry we can actually be, how visible we're allowed to be before the environment within which we inhabit becomes hostile. And it was at this point that I started really thinking about women's stress, because I don't believe for a minute that women's emotional lives can be understood separately from the environments that we are asked to survive in. Next slide. And what I learned is that hypervigilant isn't a personality flaw. It can't be separated from violence, can't be separated from fear, not from inequality, and not from the relentless pressure to remain socially acceptable. And yet we tend to look at women's distress as if it operates in a vacuum rather than operating in the society and within and under the demands that we place women through. And it's through anxiety, sometimes mysteriously, is disconnected from this context, and that hypervigilance is some kind of irrational, something irrational rather than something adaptive. I do a lot of work now around suicide bereavement and postvention support. And I hear every single day when I sit with women that we tend to apologize for crying while recounting profound trauma that has occurred to us. Oh, probably wasn't that bad. I was under a lot of stress. Oh, lots of people have had it worse than me. I remember one woman apologizing to me maybe 6 times in 10 minutes while describing this extraordinary emotional abuse. And she said to me, next slide, I probably sound dramatic. And I remember thinking, no, 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 you're not dramatic. You sound trained. You've learned to adapt to the environment. You've learned to train your own perception, and you've learned to prioritize, and this is important, the comfort of others over the reality of your own pain. And so many women become experts in this translation. We learn to translate anger into softness, pain into humor, total exhaustion into incompetence, until the very adaptation of women and their environment becomes mistaken for dysfunction. And this matters enormously for all you, because it matters when we start talking about mental health. Because what if many of the behaviours that we describe as not coping are actually just evidence of what women have had to endure? I wonder how much of what we call anxiety is actually the nervous system of women living in prolonged anticipation of violence, judgment, rejection, male anger, social punishment, emotional overload. So many of us move through the world constantly scanning tone, danger, relationships, signs that we ourselves have become too much. And yet the body learns to adapt, to stay pleasing, to stay useful, to stay small enough so that we can be safe. How many times have we heard women say, I just can't relax? And why is that? Exactly this, because our nervous systems have told us and taught us how to adapt to an environment rather than look at what is the cause of the environment. And as therapists, it's really important, and I'd like you to consider this, that if sometimes therapy unintentionally is asking women to participate in the problem, to adapt to women's own dysregulation to the environment as their cause of distress rather than the environment. Because if we're not careful, that's what we end up doing. We end up helping women adapt to environments that are still actually harming them. And we help women regulate understandable distress without asking questions about the systems that produced that distress in the first time. And it becomes particularly important when, or particularly dangerous, I think, when we consider or confuse female compliance with well-being. Because women can appear highly functioning. We can appear successful, pleasant, emotionally combined, but still be psychologically disappearing underneath the weight of what we are being asked to hold. Is this gendered? Absolutely, this is gendered, which is why I'm specifically referring to women, because we learn self-erasure. We learn it in absorbing discomfort quietly, remaining accommodating, remaining emotionally available, no matter what the personal cost is. And eventually, we see women losing contact with their own internal signals completely and stop asking, what do I feel? What do I need? What is it that I actually want? Instead of organising ourselves amongst one of the questions, which is what keeps everyone else comfortable. And I know, next slide, that this sounds dramatic. And it probably is dramatic. But I want to take what I've said for a minute, next slide, and start talking about the notion of a good woman. Is it dramatic? No, because we're all trained to do it. Then what is the good woman? Next slide. The good woman is a nervous system strategy. The good woman is someone who doesn't complain too loudly. A good woman is someone not too difficult, not too loud. You don't take up too much space, and you make sure and prioritize the comfort of everyone else over your own comfort. And it's something that women learn early. Women are rewarded for compliance. We're not rewarded for authenticity. We're taught to remain likable in the face of what can be potentially incredibly abusive situations. We're taught to maintain connection, maintain connection with people, to soften situations, even at significant personal cost. And then later, we're all surprised when women sit in your offices with burnout and struggle with boundaries and self-worth. Because we adhere and society asks us to be good women. And I think one of the most psychologically damaging things about patriarchy is not simply that it disadvantages women externally. It's that eventually women start to police themselves internally. The voice of the system, the voice of patriarchy becomes, next slide, internalized. Well, that's not the slide that I've got in my notes, but let's talk to this. The patriarchy becomes an internal voice for questioning. How many times have you apologized to someone before criticism actually arrives? And over time, women start living split lives. The external self, capable, successful, coping. The kind of self that Tanesh talked about when they introduced me. But there's also an internal self. And so many of you have heard this internal self, which is generally exhausted. It's where we become hypervigilant, emotionally overextended, and terrified of disappointing people. And it's this fragmentation that women are asked constantly live in, and it's this fragmentation, societal pressures, and our internal self that disconnects us from instinct and from desire. And it's where we're trained constantly to monitor everyone else before we actually listen to ourselves. And I'm not convinced that this is true. Next slide. The next one, because that was the one that I thought went before this one. Thank you. We hear that women are too emotional. Women are less permitted to externalize distress through power. Men are more likely to externalize their pain through anger, control, dominates, and violence. Women are more likely to internalize it into anxiety, self-blame, people-pleasing, and exhaustion. And importantly, women are still expected to remain emotionally functional while carrying it all, to continue caregiving, even though they're completely depleted, and to continue soothing everyone while emotionally collapsing themselves. And I think it's important at this juncture to start thinking about some of the greater impact of this. And it's where we're starting to see the rise of the manosphere and the tradwife phenomenon, which I'm going to address directly in a minute. Because when we strip away and start really analysing the patriarchy, we start to see how the patriarchy continues to reinvent itself and rebrand itself. But it's still about maintaining the same old positions. And what fascinates me is that many of the men dominating these spaces appeared to be deeply shaped by their own experience of powerlessness. And what does that remind you of? What does it remind me of? Is that when we look at women's movements throughout history, what underlies each and every component of that is that women assemble, women process, women demand change in the face of powerlessness, in the face of the structures which have rejected them. When we look at the manosphere, when we look at the tradwife concept, it is exactly that. It is patriarchy rebranded with Instagram filters. And when we look at what they're asking of women, they're saying, step up, be beautiful, accommodating, emotionally available, non-threatening, as though generations and generations of women fighting to simply exist as full human beings are now sold back submission as liberation. I want to touch on, thank you, before I get a little bit more into the manosphere and the tradwife concept, because I think they're really important concepts for you as mental health professionals, is this idea, next slide, of emotional labour is still labour regardless of what we and how we choose to brand it or repackage it. And I think it's important to look at the role of emotional labour in women's lives, because it's generally about women being unable to continue to carry enormous emotional loads silently. And importantly, it doesn't make women weak. In fact, I think the opposite is true. I think that women are extraordinarily adaptive. And the adaptation is often the reward that women receive for becoming invisible. Because we know women who don't complain are rewarded. The women who hold everything together get praised. Oh my God, you're so amazing. You work, you run your household, you look after your children, and you still find time for hobbies and housework. Bless, bless. We're praised for that. Is that really? Is that really fair? Is that really what's happening here? Because the collapse that occurs in women can't occur, and women collapse from all this emotional labour. It can't be looked at separately from the conditions that are producing it. Emotional labour needs to stop being referred to as just caring, and it needs to be referred to as labour. How many of you have sat around the table at a major festive or family event, be it Christmas, Easter celebrations, Hanukkah, whatever your family celebrates, and at the end of the meal, who is it that gets up, takes away the plates, cleans up, makes sure everyone's happy, having a nice time? Why does that happen? Because we're asked? No, because of decades, centuries, just simply centuries of social conditioning. And it's a great example of social conditioning unfolding in real time, because we've been taught that caregiving is simply what women naturally do. We're somehow better at it. We have a gene that somehow tells society that we're better at it. But it's never referred to as labor or work. It's just femininity. It's just how the system keeps running. And I think one of the most dangerous things about the depletion that comes from emotional labor is that we're taught to, as women, to measure our self-worth against it through caregiving, through things like self-sacrifice, through things like being depleted, through being needed, through being good. And so many women internalize the belief that love must be earned through emotional labor. Next slide. So women often mistake the depletion for femininity. And I think we're partly seeing, as I said, movements in the manosphere and trad wife, because when we strip away the branding, as I said, the algorithms and the aesthetics, what we're really looking at is simply the patriarchy reinventing himself, as I said, for the digital age. It's the same old patriarchy, the same story, just repackaged, and as I said, with better filters and better lighting. Next slide. The manosphere is patriarchy reinventing and rebranding itself. And what fascinates me is that psychologically, is that many of the men dominating these spaces share something in common. So men like Andrew Tate often present themselves as hyperpower, hypermasculine figures, but underneath all of the performance sits something else entirely. And that's disenfranchise, humiliation, disconnection, and a profound fear of powerlessness. And many men appear to have fallen outside the traditional promises of the patriarchy itself. So if you get a chance, if you haven't already, do watch Louis Theroux's beautiful documentary on the manosphere, because the thing that came through to me very clearly when I watched that is that those men who dominate this are men who appear to have fallen outside the traditional promises of the patriarchy itself. They believed that the patriarchy would guarantee them status, sexual access, importance, control, and it didn't. So they started to then hyperfeminize women as a means of controlling women, as a means of reasserting the patriarchy, because they themselves fell outside these systems. Next slide. The tradwife concept, which is that women will be compliant and beautiful and cook, and the man will be the breadwinner. And I think there are two things One is the influences that form part of the tradwife are actually being paid, dare I say it, by the far right nationalist foundations in the US. These women do not exist. They exist as brands to sell back submission to women as empowerment. And I think women are exhausted by the relentless pursuit to be desirable, independent, but not too independent, not too threatening, successful, but still endlessly emotionally available, and exhausted, but all the while navigating the systems which created this. And this creates an extraordinary internal complex, complex internal conflict, I think, within women as we carry everyone else's issues and not look after our own emotional regulation. And I think at some point we have to ask ourselves, what is required and why are people required to be resilient simply to exist safely in the world? Because despite all our language of empowerment, many of us, the same old, pressures haven't disappeared. They've simply become digitized. Next slide. We've got young girls particularly growing up inside a patriarchy that is now run by an algorithm rather than traditional men's clubs. We've got young girls growing up in a world of constant visibility, constant comparison, and constant surveillance. Young women are constantly asked to curate themselves, monitor their appearance, their desirability, their social approval. They have to be wanted, but not too sexual, confident, but not too intimidating, attractive, but effortless, ambitious, but still nurturing. And because I do not think women are weak, I think women are extraordinarily adaptive. But perhaps the real question is not what's wrong with women, because that's the wrong question, and that's the question we've been asking. But what have women been asked to navigate all the time? Because maybe we were never really lost. We were simply handed maps drawn by people who never really understood the terrain that we were being asked to navigate. And it's important to really understand what that terrain is. Next slide. Because we've got to ask ourselves, is therapy really asking of therapists to reduce symptoms? And if that is all we're asking to do, then at what point do we start questioning the environments within which women live and how those very environments have been contextualized, developed, and are implemented and enforced by a patriarchal system, which we are and have been locked out of. Next slide. And this interpretation really matters because people tell themselves, what people tell themselves, as you all know, helps shape identity. If women are repeatedly told, we're too sensitive, we're overacting, you need stronger coping skills without sufficient exploration of the environment, then we start to internalize this. And I think women already carry far too much internalized blame. We're generally blamed for our own assault if we're assaulted. When we look at particularly violence in the home, how many times do we hear, well, you could have just left. Why didn't you leave sooner? We're blamed for being too exhausted, too emotional, and as I said, too much, even when the environment surrounding us have been profoundly injuring. And it's important to help women particularly, reconnect with their own perception. Next slide. Women don't become distressed in isolation, and helping women trust the signals around them. Helping women recognize their anger may contain information rather than pathology, and helping women understand adaptation may help women from self-erasure, because many women have spent years gaslighting themselves in order to survive environments that accommodates them. And I think, next slide, an important consideration is, as I said, women live inside systems that are largely designed by men. Let me give you some examples, some really simple examples. Office place temperature. For years, workplace temperature standards were calibrated around the male metabolic rates and business training, which sounds trivial until you realise that women have for decades been sitting in freezing offices while trying to remain professional inside environments that were literally designed around male comfort. Crash test dummies. For decades, crash testing was overwhelmingly done on male bodies. Didn't consider things like breasts or pregnancy to determine car safety. Cars designed to fit standard average male height. Building standards, the heights of the tables we're sitting at right now, the heights of our kitchen benches, the widths of our doors, all designed around the understanding of the masculine being normal. Technology, when we think about technology, all designed around the masculine being normal. And so what do women do? And these are just a few examples. There are hundreds of examples I could give you. We learn to adapt, and we normalize these things which should not be normalized. I remember once asking a group of women, and I could ask the group of women here, hands up, if ever you've had to change your behavior because of fear. Next slide. And I can guarantee, without looking at how many of you are putting up your hands as you're listening to this webinar, it would be every single one of you. Not because you're irrationally fearful, but because you understand something deeply embodied, that your safety is never fully guaranteed because of the environments you move through. And this extends way beyond physical safety. It extends into how our systems are shaped by male expectations about authority, leadership, emotion, and success. Every woman in leadership will walk through extraordinarily narrow psychological tightropes. We're too soft, we're weak, we're too assertive, then you're aggressive, too emotional, you're unstable, too ambitious, you're threat, etc., etc. And what's driving this? It's inequality. And this is when inequality stops being merely social, but it becomes psychological. And I can trace my own hypervigilance through my own life, almost geographically. One of the first major lessons that I learned about silence, vigilance, self-erasure came after I was sexually assaulted as a 17-year-old. And what stayed with me most profoundly was not so much the sexual assault, is how quickly I, Janine, learned to continue functioning after that. How quickly I learned to minimize it, to contain it, to carry it privately, and to make sure other people remained calm around my pain. Next slide. I became very skilled at appearing early and very skilled early at appearing fine. And I think many women understand this. inherently. Women begin shrinking when people, before anyone even asks us to. We apologize before criticism arrives. We second guess ourselves automatically. We doubt our own perception instinctively. And eventually the system starts living inside us because power shapes environments. And the body learns the environment and the nervous system learns to adapt. And then years later, we're surprised when women start experiencing anxiety, burnout, hypervigilant perfection, exhaustion, without adequately knowing the environments within which these things were formed. And so the question really that I ask you is, what does adaptation actually really cost us as women? Because we're asked to live in systems that are designed by men. And that's not an attack on men. It's an historic reality, because for most of recorded history, men control the majority of the formal structures within which we are asked to live. Men control government. They control the laws which we live under. Look at what's happened in the US. A bunch of laws have been set by men in the last 24 months, determining what women can and can't do with their own bodies. Men control our medical systems, our financial systems, our education systems, our businesses, our urban design. And whenever one group designs systems primarily around their own experiences, those systems reflect the group's assumptions about what is normal, what is valued, and what's important. And when you look, you see it everywhere. And you see women adapting everywhere to make everyone else feel comfortable. And importantly, women often know this intellectually, not intellectually, but bodily, how to stay safe, what to wear, stay to challenge, safe to refuse, safe to become, which means that women spend years reshaping themselves around anticipated consequences. Next slide. Visibility can be dangerous for women because the distress woman experience is rarely created by a single event. And it's often amplified by the social response to the event, to disbelief, to scrutiny, humiliation, public judgment. And I think the Lerman case exposed this with extraordinary clarity if you didn't understand it, because before the criminal trial had even finished in Canberra, Higgins herself, who was not on trial, despite the fact that the trial was called the Higgins trial, she'd already been hospitalised. And it's not because the evidence had been fully tested through due process, because as we know, the trial never reached a conclusion because of juror misconduct. She was hospitalised because of the sheer volume of growing public hostility, commentary, and attack became psychologically overwhelming to her. Why? Because she became visible and because she stood up against a hierarchy that had tried to make her invisible, make her disappear, and make her go away. And that same context has been happening to her for years. When society is itself driven by social media, felt that it was okay to comment. And for those of you who are old enough, you may remember the Lindy Chamberlain case that was heard in the Northern Territory decades ago. It was exactly the same process with exactly the same outcome. Women being judged by a media and being judged by a society and a system that was never designed for her nor to support her. Power shapes perception. Media shapes perception. Social media accelerates perception. Next slide. And systems shape outcomes because, as I said, power shapes outcomes, system shapes outcome, and women understand this very deeply. And we understand it instinctively, that visibility itself become dangerous. That speaking can carry consequences. After the Lehman case, how many women were discouraged from coming forth in the face of horrendous abuse? And I leave that sitting with you. And it's not because women are weak, it's because women have watched very carefully what happens when we speak. And so this brings me back to where we started, which was the sat nav. At that strange point in time where a machine calmly tells me to head northwest, as through orientation is simple when you were never properly taught how to navigate the terrain in the first place. And I think this is what women's lives are about, that women are moving increasingly through systems that are not designed by them. We're living with the constant contradiction of appearing calm, remaining attractive. We're not allowed to age. We've got to stay emotionally regulated. We've got to stay endlessly resilient. And this adapting to constant environments shapes what often remains as an enormous emotional responsibility. And women adapt to environments that are fundamentally unequal. Because we've been asked to adapt to systems that require vigilance, accommodation, and self-erasure. Next slide. And so what the world has required of you in order to survive. Worlds where women are not required to earn safety, rest, visibility, or dignity through endless emotional labour, because women were never too emotional. Next slide. We were never too sensitive, never too much. They were responding, we were responding, often rationally, to worlds that we were never asked to carry, with impossible contradictions, and we're asked to carry this silently. And I think if mental health professionals can begin holding the context and honestly being more courageous and, understand what it is, then perhaps for the first time in a very long time, women can stop mistaking survival for freedom. Next slide. And we can do that if we understand the context within which freedom has been deemed appropriate for women. And with that, I thank you for listening to me. I look forward to your questions. One of the things that Tanish didn't say in my introduction is I'm actually beaming in from London. I arrived in London yesterday and had a very warm 33 degree day in London, but it is currently, I think, 3:53 a.m. for me. So if I'm sounding kind of a bit discombobulated, it's because it's the middle of the night. But I welcome your questions. Thank you.
And thank you, Janine, for your thoughtful responses to our audience and for your powerful presentation. Thank you to everyone who joined us today for this vital conversation on rethinking women's distress, context, power, and survival. Your engagement and curiosity truly enriched the discussion. Now, on behalf
Thank
of the
you.
Mental Health Foundation Australia, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to our speaker and to each of you for your time, attention, and commitment to mental health advocacy. And we encourage you to continue exploring this topic and to stay connected with our community as we work together to promote awareness, understanding, and support. So until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.